In today's world, prejudice still exists, often hidden behind polite smiles and silent stares. But sometimes, life has a way of flipping the script. This is the story of a quiet man in a janitor's uniform, overlooked and humiliated by those who judged him too quickly. What no one knew was that beneath the silence stood a man of power, integrity, and leadership. And when the truth is revealed, it leaves everyone stunned. What happens when the man you mock turns out to be your new boss? Get ready for a powerful story that challenges our assumptions and reminds us why respect should never depend on appearances. In the gleaming high-rise office of Harrington Enterprises, ambition buzzed louder than the fluorescent lights. Suits passed by in polished shoes, heads held high, too busy chasing promotions to notice the man quietly mopping the marble floors. Mr. Thomas, the aging janitor with tired eyes and calloused hands, moved slowly down the hallway, pushing his mop as though it were part of him. Every day, he wore the same faded uniform, greeted others with a respectful nod, and endured the cruel whispers behind his back, "Just a cleaner," they'd sneer, not even bothering to lower their voices. Some chuckled as they deliberately spilled coffee, forcing him to clean again. Others barked at him to move out of their way, never once offering a glance of acknowledgement. But what none of them knew was that Mr. Thomas wasn't always a janitor. There was a time he stood at the helm of boardrooms far grander than this one, a time when his decisions shaped industries. Betrayed and cast aside by those he trusted, he had disappeared from the corporate world, until now. Today, he walked these same halls not to clean, but to confront. The tension in the room crackled like electricity as he stepped into the executive meeting, not with a mop, but with a document in hand. A single signature away from becoming the company's new CEO. And as jaws dropped and eyes widened, Mr. Thomas looked into the stunned crowd, not with bitterness, but with quiet strength. The tables had turned. This time, they would remember his name. As Mr. Thomas stood at the head of the long, polished oak conference table, the room fell into a tense and unnatural silence. The ticking of the wall clock echoed with eerie clarity, each second amplifying the unease spreading among the gathered executives. They stared at him, some wide-eyed in shock, others masking their anxiety behind rigid postures and forced expressions. The man they had once dismissed, humiliated, and erased from the company's memory had returned. But not as a whisper from the past, he was now the force shaping their future. Among them sat Charles Whitman, once the golden boy of the boardroom. Years ago, Charles had orchestrated Mr. Thomas's downfall with calculated malice. With a charming smile and a knife behind his back, he'd planted rumors, falsified reports, and slowly turned allies into enemies. His betrayal had been swift, surgical, and merciless. Now, that same man sat stiff in his chair, his fingers trembling slightly against the leather armrest. His eyes met Thomas's, and for the first time in years, there was no confidence in them, only dread. Mr. Thomas said nothing at first. He simply placed a thick folder on the table, its gold-embossed title catching the sterile conference lights, "Final Acquisition, Approved." The documents inside spelled one thing: total control. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of every injustice he had endured. "You thought you buried me," he said, his gaze locked onto Charles. "But while you were playing king, I was building a kingdom of my own. Quietly. Patiently. Brick by brick." A sharp intake of breath was heard from one of the junior partners. No one dared move. Charles leaned forward, trying to summon the arrogant charm he once wielded so effortlessly. You can't just walk in here and," but his voice cracked halfway, betraying the panic bubbling beneath his surface. Mr. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply slid the folder toward the center of the table. "I don't need to walk in," he replied coldly. I already own everything under this roof, including the chair you're sitting in. The moment hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to break. Charles sat back slowly, defeated, as the rest of the board looked on in stunned silence. Mr. Thomas had returned, not for revenge, but for justice. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood one thing: the era of deception was over. The silence in the room was deafening, each second stretching on as if time itself was mocking Charles's growing unease. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than the whispers of doubt crawling through his mind. He had always been a man in control, always several steps ahead, orchestrating everything around him with ruthless precision. But now, as he sat at the polished boardroom table, every shred of that control seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. He could feel his hands tremble slightly under the surface, though he fought to keep them still. His throat felt dry, his breath shallow, as if the very air in the room had thickened, suffocating him. Charles instinctively leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, but it was useless. His gaze darted around the table, searching desperately for a sign of support, a flicker of defiance in the eyes of his colleagues. But they were all frozen, staring blankly ahead, their faces masks of concern, or perhaps something darker. Fear, maybe? A few of them avoided his eyes altogether, clearly as afraid of Thomas as Charles was. But what chilled him the most was the calm, almost clinical way Thomas spoke. It was the sort of calm that preceded something far more dangerous than rage. It was the calm of someone who had already won, someone who had carefully plotted every move and was now watching his enemies fall apart in real time. The sound of Eleanor Harper's voice shattered the tense stillness. It was shaky, laced with disbelief. "Mr. Thomas, this isn't how we do business," she stammered, her usual authority now completely gone. "You can't just take everything, the company, the power, and expect us to sit idly by. You're making a huge mistake." But her words hung in the air, hollow and weak, as if she knew, deep down, how pointless they were. Thomas didn't even flinch, didn't even blink. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if considering her words, before replying with a smirk that twisted his features. "Business? Is that what you think this is about?" His voice was soft, deceptively so, like a predator slowly circling its prey. "This is personal." He let the words sink in, watching as they hit their mark, as the color drained from Eleanor's face. She wasn't just speaking to a rival businessman anymore. She was speaking to a man whose entire life had been destroyed by the very people sitting around that table. And that realization struck harder than any corporate strategy. Charles's stomach churned. His mind raced, desperately trying to find a way to salvage this, to find a glimmer of hope, but there was nothing. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't the man he had once known, the man he had helped destroy. This was someone else. A man who had become something far more dangerous than a corporate rival. Thomas's gaze swept across the table, and for the first time, Charles saw something in his eyes, a cold, unrelenting fire. "You all have no idea what I've been through, do you?" Thomas said, his voice growing sharper now. "You thought you could bury me. You thought you could throw me out and steal everything I worked for. You destroyed my reputation, ruined my career, and made sure I had nothing left. But let me make one thing clear, I'm not dead. I'm not finished. And I'm not going anywhere." His words hit Charles like a punch to the gut, leaving him winded and speechless. For a moment, Charles felt himself sway in his seat, as if the ground beneath him was giving way. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat, trapped by the weight of his guilt. He was a man who had once been at the top of the game, and now, he was a man who could barely hold on to his seat. But Thomas wasn't done. He reached for the file in front of him, the one that had been left forgotten on the table, and slowly opened it, revealing the carefully stacked documents inside. Charles's heart skipped a beat when he saw the first page, a contract, one he had signed years ago, a key piece in the web of corruption that had entangled them all. But there was more. Much more. As Thomas flipped through the pages, Charles saw the truth unfold before him. Evidence. Concrete proof. Proof that would destroy everything, their empire, their freedom, their future. Thomas didn't need to speak. The documents spoke for themselves, each page a nail in the coffin, sealing their fate. The silence in the room was oppressive now, heavy with the realization of what was coming. And still, no one moved. No one dared to. "You all have a choice," Thomas said, his voice low and final, as if he were handing down a sentence. "You can let me take this company where it belongs, into the future, free of the rot you've allowed to fester. Or you can try to fight me. But be warned." He paused, his gaze piercing. "I've already won." Charles felt the blood drain from his face, his world tilting as the weight of Thomas's words pressed down on him. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. He wanted to run, to shout, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but the truth was inescapable. He was trapped. And Thomas had already claimed victory. Thomas rose from his chair slowly, almost leisurely, his dark eyes flicking over the stunned faces of the room. With a slight smile, he added, "Let's move forward. The future begins now." And with that, he turned, leaving the room in his wake. The door clicked shut behind him, and the executives were left in the silence of their own defeat. No one spoke, no one moved. For the first time in their careers, they realized they were nothing more than pawns in a game they had no control over. And Charles Whitman, once the master of it all, was now just a man who had lost everything. The room seemed suffocating, heavy with the aftermath of Thomas's departure. Charles couldn't shake the oppressive silence that fell in his wake. His hands, still gripping the edge of the table, were white with tension. He had always prided himself on being a man who controlled his emotions, who kept his composure no matter the circumstance, but now, all that control seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. His mind was spinning, a chaotic whirl of disbelief, regret, and something far darker, fear. The kind of fear that made his heart beat so loudly in his chest, it was hard to think. Thomas had come in like a storm, tearing through the fragile foundation of everything Charles had built, everything he had worked for. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, nor the realization that they were no longer the ones in charge. It was the bitter knowledge that Thomas had always been one step ahead, that they had been pawns in a game they didn't even know they were playing. Eleanor's voice pierced the silence, faint and almost fragile, as if she herself was struggling to hold it together. She stood by the window now, her eyes unfocused, her back turned to the group as if the very sight of them reminded her of everything that had gone wrong. "We need to make a decision," she murmured, her words barely louder than a whisper. "We need to figure out what comes next, how we stop him." But even as she spoke, her voice wavered, betraying the fear gnawing at her insides. The strong, assured woman who had once led the charge now seemed small, overwhelmed, as though the weight of their collective failure was bearing down on her, too. Charles wanted to say something, to offer a solution, but the words stuck in his throat, as if his mind refused to cooperate. He opened his mouth and closed it again, trapped in the suffocating grip of his own thoughts. For so long, he had been in control of everything, the company, the team, his own destiny. And now, he was nothing more than a bystander in a tragedy he could not stop. Thomas had orchestrated every move, every calculated blow. They had all been deceived, outwitted by the very person they had once thought weak, insignificant. James Walker, the former investigator with his rugged demeanor and hard-knuckled past, shifted in his seat, breaking the uncomfortable stillness. He had been quiet up until now, but Charles could see the flicker of determination in his eyes. A man who had once been known for uncovering the dirtiest secrets of the corporate world, now seemingly a shadow of his former self. His brow was furrowed, his jaw clenched in frustration. The weight of their situation was pressing on him, too. But unlike the others, James seemed to still have a fire burning inside, even if it was faint. "We can't just sit here, letting him win," James said, his voice low, but with an edge of defiance that Charles hadn't heard in weeks. His words were a challenge, not just to the room, but to himself. "We've fought for too long to just roll over. He thinks he's won, but we can still fight back. We still have something left." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or maybe just the desperation to believe that they hadn't lost completely. But Charles, his mind racing, shook his head slowly, the weight of reality settling on his shoulders like a crushing burden. "It's not enough, James," he muttered, his voice rough. "You don't understand. He's already 2 steps ahead. He always has been." The words left his mouth like poison, thick with resignation. He couldn't bring himself to fully believe in the fight anymore, not after everything that had transpired. Thomas had outsmarted them all, a master strategist, one who had known their every move before they had even made it. And now, with all their resources gone, all their power stripped away, they were left with nothing but shattered remnants of a battle they had already lost. James's shoulders slumped as the finality of Charles's words sunk in, but he refused to give in completely. He was a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness to just let it consume him now. Still, his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his tone more desperate now. "We can't just give up. We can't let him destroy everything." Eleanor, who had been silent until then, stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. The sound was sharp, jarring, as though it was the final straw that broke the fragile calm they had been clinging to. Her face was pale, her expression one of utter defeat. "What do we do?" she echoed James's question, her voice shaky, but with a thread of determination seeping through. "We fight back. We have to. If we don't, he'll take everything from us, and there'll be nothing left." Charles felt his stomach turn at the thought of fighting back, knowing how futile it would be. He could hear his own voice, though softer, sounding more resigned than he had ever heard it before. "We've already lost, Eleanor. Everything we've worked for, everything we've built, it's gone. He has us in his grip, and there's no escaping that." But Eleanor's eyes hardened with something fierce, something more akin to survival instinct than anything else. "Then we fight with what we have left," she insisted, even as a tremor ran through her hand. "We have to expose him. We have to find a way to bring him down before he destroys us all." Charles looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of the woman he once knew, the woman who had been unstoppable. The woman who had believed that no one, not even someone as dangerous as Thomas, could ever beat them. But the truth was settling in his gut like a bitter taste. Thomas had already won. The only thing left now was whether they would go down fighting or let themselves be consumed in silence. As the minutes ticked by, the oppressive air in the room grew thicker. Time, like the shadows that now crept across the walls, seemed to be running out. There was no turning back. Whatever they did next would be their last stand, against a man who had already claimed victory. And as the clock continued to tick, Charles couldn't help but wonder if they still had it in them to survive the battle that lay ahead. The weight of the silence in the room was almost unbearable. The walls felt like they were closing in, and with each passing second, the air grew thicker, charged with the tension of their failed plans. Eleanor's thoughts spun in every direction, her mind racing, yet there was a strange clarity beginning to form within her. She was a woman accustomed to being in control, but right now, she felt herself slipping, unsure of what step to take next. For a moment, she considered just letting it all go, letting herself sink into the defeat that seemed inevitable. But the fire in her heart wouldn't allow it. Not now. Not after everything they had worked for. Her eyes darted across the room, landing on her team. James, the once jaded former investigator, was staring at the floor, his fists clenched tightly, as though he were trying to suppress the rage building within him. Eleanor knew that rage all too well. James had been burned before, but this time, it was different. Thomas's betrayal had cut deeper than anything they had faced in the past. It was personal now. There was a chance they could lose everything, and that fear threatened to suffocate James's usually composed demeanor. Charles was pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. He had always been the strategist, the one who could see 5 steps ahead. But now, with the weight of their failure on his shoulders, even he seemed lost. Eleanor watched him closely as he moved, his jaw clenched tight, every step a measure of frustration. He was a man who had built his life on precision and control, yet now he seemed to be spiraling into uncertainty. She could see the hesitation in his eyes when he glanced up at her, the cracks beginning to show in the otherwise invulnerable exterior he had so carefully crafted over the years. There was no easy way out of this, Eleanor knew. She had been through too much to give in to despair now, to let fear guide their next move. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her voice was calm, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. We need to think. We can't let him control the narrative. Not anymore. Her words hung in the air, an attempt to rally them back into action, to shake them out of their paralyzing dread. She could see the flicker of hesitation in their eyes, the weight of doubt pressing down on them, but she refused to show it. Not now. James looked up, his brow furrowed, and there was a flicker of something, hope? Anger? Eleanor couldn't quite tell. But his eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man who had once fought fiercely for what he believed in. We've lost everything, Eleanor, James muttered, his voice thick with frustration. What's left for us to fight for? His words stung more than he realized. He was right, they had lost so much. The corruption of Thomas had undone years of their work, and the damage seemed irreparable. But Eleanor's resolve hardened. They had lost, yes, but that didn't mean they were out. Not yet. We haven't lost everything, Eleanor said firmly, her voice gaining strength with every word. Not if we still have something to fight for. She turned her gaze to Charles, who had stopped pacing, his hands now shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes distant. Charles, you've always been the one to see things clearly. You've always been the one with a plan. We need that now more than ever. Charles stood still for a moment, his expression unreadable, as though weighing her words against the chaos swirling inside his mind. His shoulders tensed, and he let out a slow breath, trying to push the weight of his anger and fear aside. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might collapse into himself, give in to the despair she could see building up inside him. But then, slowly, his gaze met hers, and in that gaze, she saw it. The same determination that had driven him in the past was still there, lurking beneath the surface. It was just buried, deeply hidden. But now, it was rising to the surface once more. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Fine, Charles said, his voice rough, but with a new edge of resolve. We'll go after him. But we do this the right way, or we risk losing more than just our reputation. His words rang with finality, as though he had just made the hardest decision of his life. Eleanor could see the weight of it in his eyes, the burden of responsibility threatening to crush him. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know it won't be easy. But it's the only way. She could feel her pulse quicken as the reality of what they were about to do settled in. They were about to go to war, not just against Thomas, but against the entire system that had enabled his rise. But something deep within her had shifted. She wasn't afraid anymore. She couldn't afford to be. James, too, seemed to gather himself in that moment. He stood straighter, his jaw tight with determination. Then we move quickly. We expose him for what he really is. We go public with everything. We take back the control he's stolen from us. Charles clenched his fists at his sides, his face hardening. We need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Eleanor gave them both a sharp look, a glint of fierce defiance in her eyes. We fight. We fight with everything we have left. This isn't just about saving ourselves anymore, it's about making sure he never has the chance to destroy anyone else. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. If we go down, we make sure he goes down with us. A quiet determination settled in the room as they all absorbed what had just been said. There was no going back now. They would fight, not because they were sure of victory, but because they had no other choice. It was now or never. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a surge of hope mixed with a dangerous sense of purpose. They would expose Thomas, no matter what it took. What we wear, what we do for a living, or the color of our skin, none of that defines a person's worth. True dignity comes from how we carry ourselves, and how we treat those around us, even when no one is watching. In a world quick to judge, stories like this remind us to look deeper. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the loudest truth. Never underestimate the power of humility, or the strength of someone who's been overlooked for far too long.